So you shake a stranger's hand, right? They say their name, you nod, you smile, and then like literally 3 seconds later, their name has just completely evaporated from your mind.
Oh yeah, totally gone.
Right. The conversation moves on, and you are standing there realizing you have absolutely zero idea who you are talking to.
Yeah, the information just it never even penetrated the surface. It basically bounced right off your working memory and vanished into the ether.
Exactly. We have
Yeah.
all been there. Now, I want you to take that exact same feeling of instant forgetfulness and apply it to something you are intentionally trying to learn. Welcome to today's deep dive.
It's a frustrating feeling for sure.
It really is. And our mission today is highly specific, but honestly, incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
We are decoding a practical, highly effective framework for learning and permanently retaining 10 new vocabulary words every single day without burning out.
And this is based on some really interesting source material. We're looking at an instructional guide and a transcript featuring two educators, Emily and David.
Yeah, and they're aiming their advice mostly at English language learners, right?
They are, yes, but the cognitive principles they unpack are completely universal. I mean, they apply to anyone who is trying to force new, unfamiliar data into their long-term memory.
Okay, let's unpack this. The core frustration that Emily and David tackle right out of the gate is this very common, honestly almost punishing habit. A learner sits down, they're highly motivated, and they decide to memorize a massive list of, say, 50 to 100 words.
Oh, the classic cramming session.
Right. They stare at the page, they quiz themselves, they feel super productive in the moment, but then a week later, 90% of it is just gone. It is literally the stranger at the party all over again.
Yeah, and to understand why that happens, we really have to look at how the brain actually assigns value to information. Emily uses that exact analogy of meeting a stranger.
Oh, she does.
Yeah, she points out that if you meet someone once, you hear their name, and then they just walk away forever, your brain classifies that data point as biologically irrelevant.
Basically just like junk data.
Exactly. It actively discards it to save energy, because why keep it? But if you start hanging out with that person every week, sharing meals, having real conversations, remembering their name requires zero effort.
Because you build a relationship with the data.
Right. The brain is fundamentally hostile to plain, disconnected lists of facts. It basically treats a list of 100 vocabulary words as environmental noise.
Just static.
Pretty much. The human brain evolved to remember narratives, spatial environments, emotional states, repeated encounters. You do not remember things simply because you glanced at them once,
Yeah.
You remember them because you are forced to interact with them repeatedly.
And that sets up a major collision between how we traditionally try to study and how the brain actually functions. So since the brain gets completely overwhelmed by those massive disconnected lists of 100 words, the first step of this framework requires a pretty radical shift in behavior.
It really does.
You have to drastically reduce the volume of daily input.
Yeah, the rule presented in the guide is super rigid. Learn exactly 10 words a day, never more.
See, I am putting myself in the shoes of a highly motivated learner here, and I've got to push back a bit. Let's say you have a trip to a foreign country in 2 months, or, I don't know, you are prepping for a brutal medical certification exam.
Right, the stakes are high.
Exactly. Intentionally holding yourself back to just 10 words or 10 concepts a day is going to feel incredibly slow. I mean, if someone is really motivated, isn't holding back to just 10 words a day going to feel like they're slamming the brakes on their own ambition?
Well, what's fascinating here is the massive gap between the illusion of speed and the reality of retention. In the source, David and Emily pose this hypothetical choice to really illustrate this.
Okay, what's the choice?
So option A is you learn 100 words in one day. You experience what cognitive psychologists call cognitive overload, and you inevitably forget most of them.
Right.
Or option B, you learn 10 words every single day, and you remember almost all of them.
Just because option A overwhelms the hippocampus.
Exactly. The hippocampus is basically the brain's sorting facility for new memories, and it has a very strict bandwidth limit. When you try to shove 100 isolated terms through it in a single sitting, you aren't actually learning.
You're just staring at a page.
Yeah, you are just exposing yourself to data. Small, heavily constrained goals are what prevent that cognitive overload from happening.
And, I mean, the math of consistency really proves out here. 10 words a day feels slow on a Tuesday, sure, but it equals about 300 words a month.
Right.
If you maintain that for a year, you're looking at over 3,600 new words completely secured in your long-term memory. And a 3,600-word vocabulary is enough to achieve high-level conversational fluency in almost any language. So option B just mathematically destroys the brute force method.
It really replaces this heroic, exhausting effort with a sustainable daily system.
Okay, so we have solved the volume problem by capping it at 10. But simply having a smaller list doesn't guarantee the brain is actually going to care about those 10 items.
No, definitely not.
So we need to look at how we select and process this data. And the source lays out another strict rule here. Never learn random words. You must group them by theme.
Because context provides the scaffolding for memory. The guide uses food as an example theme. So if today is food day, your 10 words are not just some random assortment of nouns and adjectives pulled alphabetically from a dictionary.
Right, it's not just A, B, C.
Exactly. Your list is going to be things like bread, butter, cheese, rice, soup, plate, knife, fork, hungry, and delicious.
I love that. I look at that process kind of like organizing a messy room. Memorizing random words is like tossing things into a giant junk drawer, you know?
Yeah, totally.
The information is in there somewhere, but you have to rummage around to find it.
Yeah.
But grouping words by theme, that feels like sorting things into clearly labeled mental filing cabinets.
That's a good analogy, but a filing cabinet kind of implies the information is just sitting there in a static, isolated box.
But fair point.
What's actually happening in the brain is much more dynamic. It is closer to building a city's road system or, using Velcro. In cognitive psychology, there's this concept called semantic networks.
Semantic networks.
Yeah, so when you learn the word plate alongside rice and fork, those neurons are literally firing together and wiring together.
They form a web.
Precisely. Every word acts as a hook for the next word. So when you try to recall the word for knife, the activation of the word bread or fork in your brain literally lights up the surrounding neural pathways. It makes it significantly easier to retrieve the missing word. You're building an interconnected neighborhood of vocabulary rather than just isolated islands.
Which brings us to the next layer of encoding, which is personalization. The guide is super adamant that you never learn a word by itself, and you never just write down the basic dictionary definition.
Right, that's a big no-no for them.
You have to craft a personal sentence. So instead of writing delicious equals having a very pleasant taste, you write something like, my mother's soup is delicious. Instead of just writing hungry, you write, I am hungry after work.
Yeah, and we talked earlier about the brain discarding irrelevant data, right? Well, personalization is exactly how you trick the brain into caring.
Because it's about you now.
Exactly. The amygdala, which processes emotion, is heavily involved in memory consolidation. When you take abstract neutral data, like the word hungry, and you tie it to your own physical state after a long day at the office, you are injecting emotion and personal relevance into that neutral data.
So the word ceases to be a sterile dictionary entry. It basically becomes a piece of your actual life.
Yeah, you are attaching the new, fragile memory of the foreign word to a strong, pre-existing emotional memory, like the taste of your mother's soup, right? The strong memory essentially acts as an anchor for the weak memory.
I love that. Okay, so we have our 10 words. They are thematically connected, and they are emotionally anchored. Now, the source moves into the actual physical mechanics of encoding this data, making it as sticky as possible.
And this requires engaging multiple senses.
Right, and the first sensory tool they talk about is visualization. But Emily takes a very specific angle on this. She doesn't just want you to picture the word. She wants you to make it weird.
Make it as weird as possible.
Yeah.
She uses the example of an apple. You close your eyes, you picture a giant, shiny, bright red apple. That's fine. But to make it truly memorable, you have to push it into the absurd. Emily suggests visualizing something like a tiny elephant drinking coffee.
That is such a hilarious image. But there is a serious biological mechanism at play there, isn't there?
Oh, definitely.
Because the human brain is basically a novelty-seeking machine. When you imagine a tiny elephant sipping an espresso, your visual cortex lights up far more intensely than if you just pictured a standard cup of coffee. The bizarre nature of the image acts as this sort of neurological highlighter.
Yeah, it takes advantage of what psychologists call the von Riesdorf effect.
The von Riesdorf effect.
Yeah, it basically states that an item that stands out like a sore thumb is far more likely to be remembered than common, everyday, expected items.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the guide doesn't just stop at visualization. It demands that you get physical with it. David points out that reading silently is a recipe for failure. You literally have to
I
vocalize.
have to.
You must speak the words out loud over and over, like delicious, delicious, delicious. And he jokes in the transcript that your walls won't judge you. But let's look at the reality of this. Sitting alone in a room, just talking to yourself, it feels a little ridiculous. Is this slight embarrassment actually worth it?
It feels incredibly awkward at first, sure, but skipping this step fundamentally undermines the entire learning process. I mean, it's deeply necessary. If you only read silently, you are relying solely on visual input. You are carving a single, narrow pathway in your brain.
So vocalizing acts as a multiplier then.
Exactly. It initiates a really complex multisensory encoding process. By seeing the word, hearing your own voice, and feeling your mouth say it, you are carving 3 distinct memory pathways instead of just one.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, when you speak the word out loud, you activate the motor cortex to coordinate your lips, your tongue, your vocal cords. That physical sensation of muscle movement is called proprioception, and it creates a memory trace all on its own.
That makes a ton of sense.
And then on top of that, your ears hear your own voice speaking the word, sending data through your auditory processing centers as well.
So you are no longer just seeing a word on a page. You are feeling it in your mouth, you're hearing it in the room. You have carved 3 distinct neural pathways to the exact same piece of information. So if the visual pathway fails during a conversation, the motor or auditory pathway can just step in and retrieve the word.
Exactly. Multisensory encoding makes the memory remarkably resilient. It is literally the difference between tying a boat to a dock with 1 thin string versus 3 thick ropes.
Okay, so we have deeply encoded our daily 10 words. They are networked, they're personalized, they're bizarrely visualized, and we've spoken them to our walls.
Right.
But all of that effort, that all happens on day 1. How do we ensure that memory doesn't just slowly dissolve over the next month?
Yeah.
Because that brings us to the architecture of long-term maintenance.
Right. So now we are shifting gears from learning to retention. And the most critical mechanism for retention laid out in the guide is spaced repetition.
Yes, and the schedule Emily and David provide for this is non-negotiable. You learn the words in the morning, you review them tonight, then tomorrow, then 3 days later, then 1 week later, and then 2 weeks later.
It's very structured.
Extremely. And Emily compares this process to watering a plant. You cannot just dump a massive bucket of water on a seed on Monday, ignore it for a whole month, and expect a healthy tree.
Right.
Vocabulary grows little by little, just like watering a plant. Consistent attention.
And that watering schedule is actually a practical application of the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve.
The forgetting curve.
Yeah. In the late 19th century, Hermann Ebbinghaus discovered that memory decays at an incredibly predictable exponential rate. Within 24 hours, you lose a massive chunk of what you learned unless you deliberately interrupt that forgetting process.
So you basically have to catch the memory right as it is slipping away.
Exactly. By reviewing the word tonight, tomorrow, and then stretching those intervals to 3 days in a week, you are forcing your brain to engage in active retrieval.
And that does what, exactly?
Well, every time you successfully retrieve that fading word, you send a biological signal to your brain that this data is necessary for your survival. And the brain responds to that by thickening the myelin sheath around those specific neural connections, literally making the signal faster and stronger.
Wow, okay. And to further validate that sort of survival signal, the source heavily emphasizes real-life application too. You cannot just keep these vocabulary words trapped in your study session. You have to map them onto your physical environment.
Right, bring them into the real world.
Exactly. So you walk around your house and you literally talk to yourself, describing your actions. You say, I'm making coffee. You look at a chair and point out a blue backpack.
Because if you only ever review your words while sitting at your desk looking at a notebook, your brain heavily associates that vocabulary with that specific physical context. By taking the words into your kitchen or using them while you're commuting, you are proving to your brain that these words have actual utility out in the real world.
The guide also pushes daily reading as a form of natural exposure, right? And they aren't suggesting dense academic textbooks here. They recommend short stories, simple news articles, easy children's books, or even just turning on subtitles while watching a movie.
Yeah, natural exposure serves as the ultimate validation for all that spaced repetition work you've been doing. Because when you unexpectedly encounter a word you've been studying out in the wild, like in a news article or a movie, you experience this little jolt of recognition.
Oh, I know that feeling. It's great.
It is, and it's a powerful reward mechanism. It proves to the brain that the effort was actually worth it, and it cements the word even deeper into your memory without any forced memorization.
That's amazing. Now, this brings us to an incredibly specific logistical rule from the guide that I want to ask you about. Emily and David are kind of militant about the physical tools you use. The instruction is to purchase exactly one notebook. Just one.
Yes, just one.
You write the word, the meaning, your personal example sentence, and you leave some blank space. They explicitly warned against writing on random pieces of paper or having multiple study journals. Why is the source so strict about not writing on random pieces of paper?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, this rule is really all about managing cognitive friction.
Cognitive friction being like the mental effort required just to start a task.
Exactly. Think about the reality of a daily spaced repetition habit. If your notes are scattered across, random sheets of paper, 3 different digital apps, and a couple of sticky notes on your monitor, you are creating chaos.
Total chaos.
When it is time for your evening review, you first have to hunt down the material. That hunt requires mental energy. It creates friction.
And when we are tired at the end of a long day, friction provides the absolute perfect excuse to just skip the review entirely.
Exactly. Mandating a single, dedicated notebook eliminates that excuse altogether. You are essentially curating a centralized personal dictionary. You know exactly where the information lives every single time.
It's just right there.
Yeah, it removes the friction of disorganized notes, making the physical act of sitting down to do your daily review effortless, which is really the only way to protect the consistency we established back in step 1.
So it is really about engineering your environment so that doing the right thing is the easiest option. So let's look at how Emily and David actually weave all these 9 steps into a practical day-to-day routine.
Yeah.
Because the structure they propose really ensures the learner can walk away with an actionable blueprint, right, that prevents them from ever feeling overwhelmed.
It does, because it operates in micro-sessions. It's not one big block. In the morning, you tackle the heaviest cognitive lift, which is learning your 10 new words.
Okay, morning is the heavy lifting.
Right. Then in the afternoon, you might spend just a few minutes practicing vocalizing them. In the evening, you construct your personal sentences. And then right before bed, you do a quick review. And then the very next morning, before you even look at new words, you retrieve yesterday's words.
So it just seamlessly integrates into the margins of your day. But they are very quick to point out some common psychological traps to avoid that can completely derail this routine too.
Yeah, there are a few big ones.
Returning to huge lists is obviously a trap. Skipping your spaced reviews is a huge trap. Falling back into only silent reading is a trap. But they highlight one trap above all the others, and that's the paralyzing fear of making mistakes.
That is a huge one. Perfectionism creates what linguists call an affective filter. It's basically a psychological block that entirely prevents language acquisition. Because if you are terrified of sounding silly, you just won't speak the words out loud. If you are afraid of writing a grammatically incorrect personal sentence, you won't do the personalization step. They heavily emphasize that every single fluent speaker on Earth made thousands of embarrassing mistakes on their way to mastery.
You just have to push through it.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean? The ultimate philosophy running underneath David and Emily's framework seems to be a complete redefinition of what studying even looks like. Success does not come from locking yourself in a room and studying all day. It comes from studying every single day.
Exactly. You don't need total mastery in one afternoon. You just need to show up and be marginally better than you were yesterday.
It takes vocabulary building, which most people view as this massive, exhausting, overwhelming chore, and it just fractures it into tiny, manageable daily habits. You are no longer stopping your life to learn. You are engineering a system where you learn while you live.
It is an incredibly powerful paradigm shift.
Let's briefly recap the core mechanics of this framework for the listener. If you want information to survive past your working memory, you have to limit your intake to just 10 items a day. Group those items by theme to build semantic networks. Inject emotion by making them personal. Visualize weird, bizarre imagery and speak the words out loud to the walls to force that multisensory encoding.
All crucial steps.
And then honor the forgetting curve by spacing out your reviews and keep it all in one single notebook to eliminate cognitive friction.
And while this system was specifically engineered for language acquisition, the biological realities it leverages are completely universal,
Right.
which leaves us with a highly provocative concept to ponder. If this multisensory, highly constrained 10-a-day method works so miraculously well for foreign language vocabulary, how might we apply this exact same framework to mastering other overwhelming domains in our lives?
Oh, that's interesting. Because it applies to almost anything requiring heavy memorization, doesn't it?
It really does. Imagine applying this to learning a complex programming language. You don't try to read an entire coding textbook in a weekend. You isolate 10 snippets of coding syntax a day, you group them by their function, you visualize their output, and review them on a spaced schedule.
Wow, yeah.
Or imagine using this to memorize historical facts and timelines for an exam. Or even returning to our very first example from the start of the show, imagine using a modified version of this to deliberately encode the names and personal details of key contacts you meet at professional networking events.
That would be a game changer for so many people.
Exactly. The underlying mechanics of the human brain remain exactly the same, regardless of the subject matter.
So you can actively engineer your habits to make learning inevitable. You do not have to just accept that feeling of information slipping away. You can choose to stop treating new knowledge like a passing stranger and deliberately build a lasting relationship with it instead. We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep that curiosity alive. Start building those semantic networks. And remember, you only need to be a little better than yesterday. We will catch you next time.